Now, there's no doubt that regulations impose transaction costs on farmers, taking them away from the activity of farming. My brother-in-law is a sheep farmer, and I've seen the paperwork associated with the movement of his animals. However, regulations are there for a reason, and those farmers who anticipate a bonfire of controls if there was a Brexit would probably be disappointed. There are four main drivers of the regulation of agriculture and food: the protection of human health, the protection of animal health and welfare, the protection of the environment, and the protection of the consumer. It is worth noting that the United Kingdom has been in the forefront of pushing the EU's smart regulation agenda, which emphasises the need to make impact assessments for significant proposals, even if that's quite a difficult process, as we learned this morning, the desirability of seeking alternatives to legislation, the need to evaluate current legislation, so-called fitness checks, and the importance of consulting on proposed regulations. Another defining characteristic of the UK policy approach has been that risk management should be based on robust science and evidence. This has led it at times to question risk management decisions as being unduly risk-averse, leading to disproportionate legislation, for example in relation to plant protection, about which I will say more later. Farmers receive substantial subsidies from the European Union. The payment of these subsidies in the UK by the World Payments Agency and by devolved administrations is often badly delayed, with consequences for farmers' cash flow. This is partly the responsibility of the agency, but it also reflects the complexity of regulations and the difficulty of applying them. Simplification of CAP rules has been an objective of the European Union for some time, but progress has been slow. In part, this reflects the fact that the regulations are the result of an often messy compromise between different interests. Greening the CAP is another long-term objective, although it should be noted that proposals to create a third pillar of the CAP to tackle climate change were quickly dropped, while progress on ground-level air pollution, where agriculture is a significant contributor, has also been relatively slow. Some of the policy instruments that have been used to green the CAP have been rather blunt, imposing substantial constraints on farmers, but contributing relatively little to environmental objectives. For example, the so-called 3 crops rule requires farms above a certain size to grow at least 2 crops, and even bigger ones 3 crops. One could argue that it's not a very effective way of dealing with the issue of monoculture, and in any case, that is a relatively minor problem when we compare it with something like climate change. Now, plant protection, or pesticides as it's sometimes known, has been an area of particular concern for farmers in recent years. The number of available synthetic products has reduced, in part for commercial reasons, in part because of regulatory interventions. Recent restrictions on 3 neonicotinoids by the European Union, without what is regarded as sufficient field trial evidence to back the decision, has posed difficulties for farmers growing oilseed rape. From the perspective of the NFU, they argue, the EU plant protection legislation, which lays down rules for the placing of plant protection products on the market, introduced hazard cut-off criteria that lowers the threshold of tolerance for active toxicity, rather than adopting a risk-based approach. The implications for agriculture is that this leads to further restrictions on vital crop protection products, important for securing crop yields and quality. A further difficulty is that the internal market in relation to plant protection products is incomplete because of continuing regulatory barriers. This reduces incentives to develop and register new products, particularly biologicals, which may serve as substitutes for withdrawn chemical products or complement existing synthetics. Those biologicals represent a more environmentally sustainable approach to plant protection. Registration is based on a 2-tier system, with active ingredients being approved at the European Union level and products being approved by government agencies at the member state level. These agencies have varying levels of resourcing, and the quality of some of them has been questioned. Indeed, I could tell a few horror stories about that. Delays occur in the registration process, which can take as long as 8 years for a new product, making it difficult for innovative products to recoup their development costs. Now, the European Union has sought to overcome these problems by introducing a zonal system of registration, with 3 climate-based geographical zones across the EU and 1 for glasshouse products. The idea was that once a product had been approved by one authority in the zone, it could then be quickly adopted by the other member state authorities. As is so often the case in the European Union, Implementation has been far from straightforward, and the system is still not fully operational. Now, a question was asked this morning about animal welfare, and of course Article 13 of the Lisbon Treaty stipulates that animals are sentient beings and requires that the development of EU policies should pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. Now, of course, in practice, as was asked this morning, the implementation and enforcement of those regulations is very patchy and varies across member states. This is something the Commission admits, that in fact there are inefficiencies in implementation and enforcement. Nevertheless, achieving this treaty change was seen as a significant step forward by animal welfare organisations. It should be noted that British vets are seen as particularly influential within the relevant technical committees of the European Union. These are vets who usually have direct experience of farm animal work and understand the concerns of farmers. The EU's approach to animal health is based on the maxim that prevention is better than cure. It focuses on preventive measures, disease surveillance, controls and research in order to minimise incident and impact, not least in relation to human health and economic costs, of potentially devastating outbreaks of animal diseases such as bovine TB, avian flu and foot and mouth. In May 2013, the Commission adopted a proposal for a single, comprehensive animal health law on transmissible animal diseases to replace the myriad complexity of existing rules, around 400 separate acts, and to improve the efficiency of enforcement through a more streamlined and simplified approach. The European Parliament and Council reached a political agreement on this in June 2015, pending formal adoption. This new animal health law will provide a general framework for the prevention, notification, control and eradication of animal diseases. Now, the EU has effectively prevented the commercial use of genetically modified crops, which are, of course, grown extensively in the United States, Canada, Latin America and elsewhere in the world. Is this the right or wrong kind of regulation? Well, I think this poses a general question, because it all depends on where you stand on this controversial issue. If you think GM crops are a good thing, you think this is the wrong kind of regulation. If you think they're a bad thing, then of course you have a different view. And the point is, here is a general point, I think. Regulatory issues are not just questions of burden reduction or efficient implementation. They're also questions of political judgment. Now, as far as food regulation is concerned, the emphasis has been on free movement and on food safety. It has been argued that regulations are safe and comfortable, but not that useful. In particular, there has been a relative neglect of nutritional issues, which are important in relation to key health issues such as obesity. But that, of course, in turn reflects defects in the scope of the common agricultural policy and the way in which it focuses too much on agriculture and not enough on questions of food. Good policy instruments in the form of regulations rely on well thought out and comprehensive policy objectives. If you haven't got the policy right in the first place, then you're not going to have an effective and helpful system of regulation. Thank you.
Specific measures are driven mostly by environmental objectives, but also a lot by single market objectives, and a lot of the measures are to do with product standards or process requirements, and so there's a significant desire to avoid upsetting the single market and creating a bumpy playing field. EU environmental law is now probably the most comprehensive and one of the most ambitious in the world. It used to be way behind the US. It's now, let's say, considerably ahead of the US and is copied by quite a large number of other countries in other parts of the world. It's relatively mature. It's generally stopped expanding very much at the moment. And it's quite strategic and long-term. A lot of measures set goals ahead, like climate change, a good example. We're working towards 2050 objectives, Water Framework Directive has long-term goals, Habitat Directive has long-term goals. And so it tends to proceed by a process of trying to agree where the right outcome is and then to move towards it aggressively. Implementation is extremely variable and often not particularly transparent. The UK is an example of imperfect implementation, as people will be aware of, with air quality standards in cities like London, for example. That's a particularly difficult regulation to implement. What are the results of this pretty large-scale regulatory effort? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of regulations and directives. Standards on the environment have been driven up in Europe, including the UK. We're talking about air pollution, water pollution, waste management, levels of recycling, regulation of chemicals, the degree of pollution in the oceans, the level of investment in nature protection and so forth. So the EU is a driver of environmental standards, and it has considerable influence outside the EU, outside Europe itself, and has some leverage on other players on the world stage, including on climate, on biodiversity, on waste management. The EU is a leading player and has considerable collective influence. There are, of course, winners and losers from this exercise, and when you look at impact assessments, it's difficult for them to capture the huge variation in outcomes. Rust Belt industries will tend to leave the EU anyway because they're driven by labour costs, and a whole lot of new industries which benefit from regulation because they're, if you like, they're regulatory based. Renewable energy is a clear example. They depend on regulation. And one of the merits of EU regulation, one of its drawbacks, is that it's relatively difficult to change. It's not very sensitive to the political cycle. It gives you long-term certainty, which is why there's a surprising degree of support, you might think, amongst industry as a whole for environmental regulation. A, they can see a reasonable playing field across Europe, certainly not about flaws, and B, they know what the direction of travel. You can't build up a renewables industry unless you've got some confidence for 10, 20, 30 years. And the same thing with clean water supplies. So EU regulation provides stability, even if it isn't necessarily optimal from the point of view of any one player. Impacts in the UK are, certainly, it's in most cases driven up environmental standards, and given the UK more leverage elsewhere. In short, it's increased environmental ambition in the UK. It leads to more stringent implementation than without the EU. So if you're a government minister or civil servant, you have to do a risk analysis about how far you would like to avoid implementation against the possibility that you're going to end up in the European Court and pay a large fine. And so in practice, governments in the UK and elsewhere do give some prioritisation to implementing EU law over national law if there's a certain pipeline, which often is if the decisions to be made between the two. So a lot of the players in the environment community are heavily supportive of EU regulation because they feel much more confident that once it's there, it will be applied. Of course, in the Brexit scenario, it's much less clear what the level of implementation might be, even if the same legislation remains on the statute book. Also, EU law is more precise in most cases than UK law and leaves less room for discretion. And that, of course, is a source of, for the implementing authorities, that can be a source of tension, and it can be a source of confidence as well. You can see slightly more clearly what's going on the whole. So if we look ahead, what's going to happen? Well, the great era of making EU environmental legislation is largely over. We're now making incremental change outside two very important areas, one of which is to do with climate change, we've heard about already, another which is to do with the so-called circular economy, which is about waste management, reusing products, eco-design, and trying to reduce resource use over time. That will continue to be a very active role. These are both areas where the UK will intervene and regulate inside or outside the EU. And you can ask, well, how far would the UK independently follow its own path differently? In order to try to make a very, very simple picture of what difference would Brexit make, the environment is really good enough to say inside the EEA or not. Inside the EEA, nearly all environmental regulation applies, with some quite important exceptions like the Habitats Directive and the Bathing Water Directive. But of course the UK does not have the ability to influence that legislation. Outside the EEA, there are variations on the scenario. There would be a need to comply with some EU legislation, either by virtue of the need to export products to the EU and to comply with the relevant EU specifications, or because there's almost certainly would be some pressure in the negotiations to adopt certain measures if the UK wanted access to the single market on reasonably preferential terms. But, and here's, I think, a reason which, a very, very important difference, the logic of being outside the EU, being outside the single market, is to try to gain some positional advantage, some kind of economic advantage. And if a future government is not inclined to deregulate, what is the point of being outside the single market? So, from the point of view of the environment, there is a significant danger that outside the EU, the structural pressures and the short-term pressures will be to weaken environmental legislation, which explains why most environmental organisations think the balance of risk for the environment is really clearly in one direction, greater risk on the Brexit scenario.
There are 12 million disabled people in the UK, and yet very few conversations around this issue are being had at all. 300 pieces of legislation sit in UK law that relate specifically to disability, primarily around the areas of access, both physical access, which I think is the one that people are most au fait with, comms access, so the right to have things that are written in easy read or in braille, and that they go to as basic as being on the back of medication packages, equality more generally, and also the point of participation. Interestingly, disabled people are the least likely group of people in the electorate to vote, and that in itself has some interesting dynamics when you start thinking about legislation around where does some of that electoral pressure come from. But I'll just leave that behind there. I guess I'd like to look at a kind of couple of pieces around implementation, and a piece specifically around employment. So often the debate that you hear is the issue around how difficult is it, due to EU legislation, for employers, particularly SME employers, to employ disabled people. And I think that's it's hugely different in terms of the way this is implemented across Europe. I guess I would just compare the fact that, so those of you that saw me walk in, that saw me earlier would have seen that I walked with crutches. And UK law meant up until 1995 it would have been okay for any organisation that employed less than 15 people to choose to not employ me, simply on that fact, regardless of whether or not I required any additional help or support in order to be employed. And I think what we do find is, certainly as an organisation, we work with lots of employers to enable them to employ disabled people. And actually it's about the implementation of the legislation that becomes really critical, rather than the heart of what's actually there on the legislative books. Often there are ways to do these things in a way that's sensible and a way that's useful. So I think there's something about us kind of having a really good debate about the implementation of legislation more generally, but particularly in this area. I guess the other thing that is a key area is around trade. So one of the things that's quite important at the moment is around ensuring that if anybody wants to trade with Europe and trade with ourselves, that any requirements are met. And I guess the most obvious example is if you are building a building in the UK, there are certain size of lifts that you need to have that enable people who are wheelchair users to be able to access that building. Lots of that kind of technology comes from outside of the EU, and it would be obviously being able to make a smaller lift is often cheaper. So there's something kind of quite important about having some of that framework that's there from a trade perspective that means people meet those legislations and laws in order that we kind of enable some of this activity to continue. For disabled people, what are the real worries? Well, lots of disabled people aren't engaging in the debate because it feels quite far away from the things that matter to disabled people every day. But the things that disabled people tend to talk about are their access to work across Europe. And I guess this is a great example of the different implementation across member states, because often social policy, or because social policy is agreed at a member state level, whilst there is legislation there today that supports disabled people to have access to employment and access to equality, there's some real realities around social policy, particularly around health social policy, which might mean that a disabled person who had some health needs would be unable to work somewhere else because they wouldn't have that same access to health that they would have in the UK. Similarly to benefits in social housing. So I think there's a really interesting question about the extent to which the framework is helping or needs to go further, or there's more to do in that space. And I think the other element that when we talk to disabled people that kind of is really critical about some of the legislation is almost that ability to have somewhere to go. So the European Court of Justice has been used in a number of cases to ensure that what's happening here in the UK is actually in line with EU legislation. There's some quite key agreements that have come out of some of that activity. So for me, there's a real issue here around what's going to happen post in a Brexit scenario. The reality is we don't know, because there hasn't been sufficient discussion about policy, there hasn't been sufficient discussion about what will happen around those 300 laws. So I think there's a real issue there around what would happen, and certainly we find it very difficult. We attempted to do something similar to what Wynne did here, and actually we had so many problems we just stopped doing it, because actually the impact of that was so difficult. So for me, the real issue here is about predictability, about implementation, is about what we do next, and is about what some of those alternatives are.